Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we dive into one of the most overlooked but consequential uprisings in early Islamic history, the Berber Revolt of 740. A rebellion that wasn't just about swords and sand, it was about systems, survival, and sovereignty. So here's a question to kick us off. What happens when an empire expands faster than it can integrate, and treats its new citizens more like subjects than equals? To answer that, we have to go back to the early 8th century, when the Umayyad Caliphate was riding high on the wave of conquest. Their empire stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the edges of Central Asia in the east. And yes, that included North Africa, a region rich in land, people, and, more importantly, tax revenue. Now, North Africa wasn't just some remote desert on the empire's edge. It was a strategic frontier, prime real estate for further expansion and a vital artery for imperial resources. But here's the twist. The people who lived there, the Berbers, weren't outsiders. They had recently converted to Islam. They were fellow Muslims, part of the Ummah, and yet, they weren't treated like it. Instead, they found themselves locked in a system that taxed them heavily, excluded them from power, and subjected them to Arab-centric rule. Imagine converting to a new religion only to be told you're still second class. Yeah, not exactly the spiritual welcome one hopes for. This wasn't just a cultural misunderstanding. It was a structural imbalance, a geopolitical powder keg on the edge of the empire, primed to explode. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk systems. Because this revolt, it wasn't just about oppression, it was about incompatible operating codes. Imagine trying to plug a decentralized tribal network into a rigid, top-down empire. Sparks are bound to fly. At the heart of the Umayyad rule was a highly centralized apparatus. Think bureaucracy, taxation, and control. The jizya tax on non-Muslims and the Kharaj land tax didn't just fund the empire, they enforced its dominance. But here's the catch, even after Berbers converted to Islam, they were often still forced to pay the jizya. That's like being told, you're in the club, but you still have to pay the outsider fee. Add to that military conscription, Berber men being drafted to fight in imperial campaigns far from home, often with little say and even less reward. This wasn't governance by consent, it was governance by extraction. Now compare that to the Berber way of doing things. Their clans operated on kinship, mutual obligation, and consensus-based authority. No formal tax code, no bureaucrats in robes, just decentralized leadership rooted in loyalty and shared values. The tribe was the nucleus. The idea of some faraway governor demanding tribute, that wasn't just offensive, it was alien. And here's where things get thorny. Even as Muslim Berbers paid taxes like non-Muslims, Arab elites held onto the most powerful positions, controlling land, law, and the military. The message was clear. Conversion didn't mean inclusion, it meant compliance. So you've got two visions of order. One, imperial and hierarchical. The other, tribal and participatory. When those systems collide, history doesn't just bend, it cracks. Alright, so we've got a mismatch of systems, unequal treatment, and a marginalized population. What happens next? Well, it doesn't take a genius to see where this is going. The year is 740, and the Berbers have had enough. This wasn't a random uprising, it was the result of long-term pressure building beneath the surface. Let's break down exactly what lit the fuse. First, discriminatory governance. For the Berbers, the promises of Islam, brotherhood, equality, justice, weren't matching the reality. They had embraced the faith, but under Umayyad rule, they were still being treated like outsiders, taxed, ignored, exploited. It's like being invited to a feast and then being asked to serve the food while everyone else eats. Then there's the economic exploitation. We're talking heavy taxation, outright land seizures, and forced military service that pulled young men away from their homes and communities. For many Berber tribes, this was more than just policy, it was plunder in disguise. They weren't reaping the benefits of empire, they were paying for it. And just when things couldn't seem more unjust, enter the Kharijites. This wasn't your average theological movement. The Kharijites preached a radical message of equality and divine justice. They believed any pious Muslim, Arab or not, could lead. And for the Berbers, that message hit home like thunder. It gave moral clarity to their grievances. It transformed frustration into purpose. So we've got oppression, economic pain, and a powerful ideology calling for justice. That's not just a rebellion waiting to happen, that's a revolution ready to roar. And then, the spark becomes a wildfire. The Berber Revolt didn't begin as a grand, unified movement. It began as a scattered resistance, tribes standing up to imperial policies in their own regions. But here's the twist, decentralized doesn't mean disorganized. In fact, it turned out to be a strength. One of the earliest and most symbolic moments came at the Battle of the Nobles, a name that should already tell you something. Arab elites, The so-called noble class marched in expecting a swift victory. What they got was a brutal reality check. The Berbers crushed them. That one battle exposed cracks in the imperial armor. The myth of Umayyad invincibility shattered, and that victory didn't stay isolated. Word traveled fast. The revolt spread across the Maghreb of modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and then spilled over into Al-Andalus, what we now call Spain. Think about that. A movement sparked on the empire's periphery suddenly echoing in one of its crown jewels. That's not just rebellion. That's a wake-up call. The Umayyad response? Slow, cumbersome. Centralized empires are powerful until they're not. When stretched thin, they can't adapt quickly. The further they tried to reach, the more fragile their grip became. This was more than a military uprising. It was a systems shock, and the empire was wobbling. So, what happens when the edge of an empire rises up and wins? The consequences of the Berber Revolt didn't just stay in North Africa. The shockwaves rolled across the Umayyad world, reshaping its political landscape in ways that would echo for generations. First, the obvious. The Berbers gained autonomy. Not total independence, not formal statehood, but real, on-the-ground control of their regions. The central government simply couldn't reassert its authority, so local Berber leadership filled the vacuum. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a reclamation of governance. But that vacuum wasn't limited to the Maghreb. Remember Al-Andalus? The revolt helped fracture Umayyad control there too. With instability rising, the empire began to lose its grip. Local governors started acting more like independent rulers than loyal administrators. The chain of command loosened, the imperial glue starting to crack, and then came the deeper structural consequence. What historians might call systemic fatigue. The Umayyads were already juggling unrest, economic strain, and theological dissent. The Berber Revolt didn't collapse the empire by itself, but it weakened it seriously. And just a few decades later, the Abbasid revolution swept in, toppling the Umayyads from power entirely. So was the Berber Revolt the cause? Not exactly. But was it a sign that the empire's foundations were rotting? Absolutely. Revolts don't just happen in a vacuum. They're symptoms of a deeper disease, and sometimes they accelerate the fall. Alright, now let's zoom out. History isn't just a series of events. It's a mirror. And the Berber Revolt? It reflects a powerful lesson about how systems of power rise and how they fall. At the heart of this revolt was a breakdown in incentives. The Umayyad system was designed to centralize control, extract resources, and preserve elite dominance. It was efficient in conquest, but brittle in maintenance. Why? Because its incentives ran in one direction: take more, give less. When people, like the Berbers, saw that conversion didn't bring equality, that loyalty didn't bring protection, and that obedience only deepened their exploitation, the rational response wasn't submission, it was resistance. And here's where it gets interesting. The Berber Revolt wasn't led by a charismatic emperor or a unified army. It was driven by decentralized actors who had local legitimacy. That made it harder to crush. Each tribe was rooted in its own community, guided by shared norms and traditions, not imperial commands. You can behead a rebel leader, but how do you behead a network? The Umayyads, like many centralized regimes, underestimated the power of local systems. They believed control came from the top down. But history shows, again and again, that systems built on force without consent eventually collapse under their own weight. The Berber Revolt reveals the danger of ignoring feedback loops. When a governing system punishes its most loyal subjects, denies them justice, and treats them as second class, eventually, those subjects stop playing by the rules. And when enough people opt out, the whole system breaks. It's not just a lesson from the past. It's a blueprint for understanding power today. So here we are, standing at the end of a story that most history books barely mention. The Berber Revolt wasn't just a local uprising or a footnote in Islamic history. It was a systemic reckoning, a moment when the periphery pushed back against the center, not out of hatred for the empire, but out of betrayal by it. We're often told that the early Islamic world was unified, harmonious, even utopian. But the Berber Revolt cracks that narrative wide open. It shows us a more complicated reality, one where faith didn't guarantee fairness, where conversion didn't mean inclusion, and where centralized power struggled to understand the people it ruled. But maybe the most important lesson here isn't about the Umayyads. It's about the timeless tension between power and principle. When rulers ignore the very values they claim to uphold, when systems punish cooperation and reward submission, eventually, the people rebel. And often, it's the decentralized, the local, the overlooked communities that strike the first blow. History isn't made solely by kings and caliphs. It's shaped by shepherds, warriors, tribesmen, ordinary people who decide enough is enough. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. And if you'd rather listen on the go, check out the podcast version in the link in the description. New episodes drop every day. And if this story made you think differently about empire, rebellion, or forgotten resistance, Stick around, we've got plenty more untold stories coming your way.